I've got this project to do on the First World War. My teacher suggested looking at the National War Memorial. It tells the whole story, she says. I've never seen the memorial. Is there a website where I can have a look? I'll call it up. Thanks for the tip. I'll let you know what I find. Few fights or arguments begin logically. So it was with the First World War. There was little or no logic to this war. This war was about power and control. It started in Europe in the summer of 1914. A fight seemed to be brewing. On one side was the so-called Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It was flexing its muscles against the so-called Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Great Britain. And then in June 1914, the assassination in Bosnia of an obscure archduke, heir to the Austrian throne, resulted in more than just saber-rattling. It resulted in war. Austria made the first move by declaring war on Serbia. Russia moved in to defend the Serbs. Germany, Austria's ally, declared war on Russia and then on France. France called on Britain for support, and Britain came in, automatically bringing Canada along with it. It was a very different time in Canada then. We were a small country of only 8 million people. We were a young country, a pioneering country, a country of farmers and ranchers and cowboys and lumberjacks and traders. We were a hardy lot, skilled in the use of our wits and our muscles. We were a country that was still very much a part of the British Empire. We were not sophisticated in the ways of war, but many Canadians felt close to Britain, a country in which many of us had been born, a country that many of us had just come from. The fight was alongside the British for the cause of the Empire. This was definitely a European war, but at first everyone became caught up in the enthusiasm of the cause. So much so that the outbreak of war was met with celebration in the streets in Europe and in Canada. Everyone wanted adventure. There's something very romantic about war. Besides, this war would only last a summer, wouldn't it? Our boys would win, they'd come back home, they'd be heroes. When the war broke out, there was only a regular army in Canada of about 3,000 soldiers, most of whom had been born in Britain. There were 684 horses, 300 sailors, and only 2 canvas airplanes. But nearly overnight, 33,000 young men signed up. They gathered to train at a camp at Valcartier near Quebec City. They earned $1 a day. This would not be the great adventure that everyone thought it would be. Instead, it would be an exercise in survival that would test the mettle and challenge the spirit of these Canadian boys. Some lessons were learned early. In fact, the new recruits had to wait months for uniforms, and then many of the clothes fell apart. There were complaints that their boots seemed to be made of brown paper and that things could have been better organized. Nevertheless, only 2 months after signing up with little training or experience, the first contingent of Canadians went sailing off to Britain. They were called the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and they were young. So young. Some you couldn't call men. Some were boys, barely in their teens, who lied about their age to go off to the Great War. They missed their families. They missed their friends. They had no idea what lay ahead. That they could never imagine. They arrived in England and waited and trained and waited some more during what was probably the country's most bitter winter. Finally, the Canadians set out to do battle as part of the British forces. They headed to the Western Front, an area that included parts of France and Belgium. Some of the most important battles of the First World War took place there. In April 1915, nearly a year after signing up, our Canadian soldiers finally saw some action. And what they experienced was horrendous. It was at the Battle of Ypres, just one of several battles that would be fought during the war for this Belgium town. This battle was notorious, as the German army used this opportunity to experiment with chlorine gas. Many French soldiers died, their lungs seared by the poison. The Allied lines collapsed, and the German army poured through the gap. But using simple common sense, our soldiers figured out how to stay alive. They urinated on their handkerchiefs, then used them as filters covering their noses and mouths. The Canadians held the line. Ypres will be forever remembered because of the fighting spirit of the Canadians. Thanks to our soldiers, the German advance was stopped. Never mind that it took 6,000 Canadian casualties to achieve that. Back home, this was considered a victory, albeit a costly one. It was here, too, that our boys first gained a reputation for being a tough and rugged bunch of fighters. After Ypres, everyone knew that when Canadians were involved, the fighting would be tough. The Prime Minister of England later wrote that whenever the Germans faced the Canadian Corps coming into the line, they prepared for the worst. If it was ingenuity and spirit that brought the soldiers through battles, it was sheer will and resolve that kept them going in the trenches. Everyday life in the trenches was grim. It was unimaginable, like living in a grave. The mud was full of germs and rotting corpses of soldiers who had often been dead for weeks and even months. Soldiers' feet were constantly wet and diseased. For amusement and target practice, soldiers would shoot the rats that scurried between them. And rats weren't the only pests. The soldiers had lice crawling all over their bodies. Here's how one Canadian describes how to deal with this problem.
We are filthy. Our bodies are the color of the earth we've been living in these past months. We are alive with vermin and sit picking at ourselves like baboons. It is months since we have been out of our clothes. Fry suddenly appears at the door with a flat iron in his hand. "What's that for?" Broadband asks. "The lice," Fry grunts. "What are you going to do, brain 'em?" You just watch. He takes a board and places his tunic on the board. We watch closely. He heats the iron over the fire and then runs the hot iron down the seam. There is a quick series of cracks. Little spurts of blood come in a stream from the inside of the seam. Fry looks up triumphantly. "That's the way to kill 'em. And it kills the eggs, too." Well, we all take off our tunics and trousers and begin to iron the lice out of our clothes.
Canadian men and boys still continued to volunteer for service. Back then, the lines of communication were hardly immediate. Little did people at home know of the realities of life in the trenches or on the battlefield. Many still harbored romantic notions of war. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, 1916. 4 months later, it sputtered to an end. It was really a series of battles along the Somme River Valley in France on the Western Front. The British commander hoped to break through the German lines by first destroying them with heavy bombardment and then sending the soldiers over. So, after 7 days of incredible artillery fire, the troops went over the top, as they called it. They marched, laden with heavy packs, toward the German trenches, which were supposed to be mostly destroyed. But they weren't. The enemy had hidden in deep dugouts to escape the bombardment, and as the British attacked, the Germans came back up and began to pick them off with machine guns and shell fire. The slaughter was unbelievable, with almost 60,000 British casualties on the first day alone. Among these was a unit from Newfoundland, which was a separate British dominion back then. In the first hour, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, almost the entire Newfoundland regiment of nearly 800 men were killed or wounded at a place called Beaumont Hamel. And over the next 4 months, nearly 30,000 Canadians, the population of a good-sized Canadian town, were killed, wounded, or missing at the Somme. And only 6 kilometers of ground were gained for the British side. Canadian troops made their reputation at Ypres, but many people say they made their nation at Vimy Ridge. This was a watershed battle. Canadians and their country are said to have grown up here. Vimy Ridge was 7 miles long, providing a perfect lookout for each side since it overlooked a flat plain-like expanse. Arthur Currie, a former real estate mogul from British Columbia, was the commander of the 1st Division of the Canadian Corps. Although they were under British command, Currie and his fellow officers adopted a style of battle plan that was not common to British commanders in this war. Currie helped devise a plan, and against tradition told his troops what it was long in advance. Then he made his men practice and train and practice and train some more. Canadian soldiers dug trenches and tunnels and built roads and even some light railway tracks in order to prepare for moving the army forward on the day of the attack. Everyone, from the highest ranking officer to the lowest, knew the plans and knew exactly what was expected of them. The men were even issued maps, something that was unheard of. The result of this advanced preparation? The Canadians were victorious, and Currie was made commander of the Canadian Corps. In a matter of hours, Canadians took most of the ridge. In a matter of hours, a new feeling had arisen in the Canadian Corps. No longer colonists, but men fighting on behalf of their own country. However, over 3,000 of our men died at Vimy. There was a high price to pay for every success in this war. The irony of Vimy is that while Canadians were seeming to win the war in Europe, they were losing it at home. Fewer and fewer were volunteering to go overseas. In 1917, war was no longer a romantic notion. Much had changed in 3 years. What to do? The battles on the Western Front had taken their toll on Canadians. New recruits were needed. One way to reinforce the ranks was to force men to join. This is called conscription, and it turned into a bitter debate on the home front. Some said we must support our troops on the front lines overseas. Others wondered why we were mixed up in a war that was being fought in Europe. Much strife was created between the English and French Canadians, many of whom felt no attachment to the Empire and the war. Soldiering during the Great War was an exclusively male enterprise, but the war changed the lives of women too. Some experienced the horror of the front lines working as nursing sisters, and several lost their lives. Since there were fewer men around, women took on non-traditional jobs such as working in factories, making ammunition, or driving streetcars. Women, or at least the wives, sisters, and mothers of soldiers, were also given the right to vote for the first time. The move was political. The government of the day wanted more public support for conscription, and wives and mothers and sisters of the soldiers would surely support any measures to help them out. But whatever the motivation, women were finally allowed to cast a ballot. A precedent was set. In the summer of 1917, the British commander decided it was necessary to push forward on the front in Belgium, in a region known as Flanders. The resulting Third Battle of Ypres, or simply Passchendaele, had many observers wondering if any lessons had been learned from the previous failures in this war. All through that rainy summer and autumn, the British troops fought in horrible conditions, in waist-deep mud as they tried to dodge German shell fire and machine guns. There were almost 250,000 casualties, and the smell of death was in the air when the British commander sent the Canadians in October. The Canadian troops had a reputation by then. The Canadian General Currie disagreed with his superior and said it would cost too many lives, perhaps as many as 16,000 casualties in all. But he had orders. All he could do was to prepare and rest his men to minimize these casualties. Against impossible odds, the Canadians moved forward through the deep mud and shell holes to finally take the destroyed village of Passchendaele. And as Currie predicted, there were almost 16,000 dead, wounded, or missing Canadians. The bodies of over 1,000 have never been recovered and remain buried in the mud under the fields of Flanders today. But now, it was the beginning of the end. In the spring of 1918, the German army made a big push forward, and the Allied troops retreated. The German army came very close to victory. However, by now the German troops were exhausted, war-weary, and near the breaking point. And then, in August 1918, the final Allied counterattack began with the breakout at the Battle of Amiens, led again by the colonial shock troops, the Canadians and the Australians. This is the beginning of what is known in history as Canada's 100 Days, the March to Mons, Belgium. The terrible trench warfare was finished as the armies finally broke out into the open. It was the Canadian troops that spearheaded the attack for the British. The German army began to pull back for good. Victory for the Allies was near. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Germans surrendered. The war was over. This war was called the Great War, a war that was to last a summer, a war that was supposed to end all wars, but one which took the lives of over 65,000 young Canadians. So what have I learned? It was this terrible war that allowed us to stand on our own and first gain the respect of other nations. Canada put its own signature on the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that ended the war. We now stood as a full partner to Britain, an ally, a trusted friend, but no longer a subordinate. We had distinguished ourselves through the baptism of fire that was the First World War. It's really incredible to see what these guys went through back then, over 80 years ago. A lot of these guys were about our age. We owe them so much. Because of what they did and what their sons and daughters did in the Second World War, and later, Canada's now recognized around the world for its peacekeeping role. And just maybe, if we work hard enough, we'll never have to go through another war like this.